At present, the United States has the lowest life expectancy of the top dozen richest countries in the world. We also have the greatest share of our diet composed of ultra-processed foods. In fact, most of our diet. Most of what goes into our mouth isn't considered real food. Could there be a connection? Ultra-processed foods are said to be troublesome for a wide variety of reasons, like all the packaging, etc., but I'm just going to discuss the health aspects. Based on studies encompassing nearly 10 million participants, greater exposure to ultra-processed food was associated with a higher risk of a variety of adverse health outcomes, including all-cause mortality, meaning living a significantly shorter life. As a reminder, ultra-processed foods are industrial formulations of processed food substances that contain little or no whole foods, and typically include flavorings, colorings, emulsifiers, and other cosmetic additives. Think Twinkie. So nutritionally vacuous that you could go blind from nutrient deficiencies if that's all you ate, like this 14-year-old boy who apparently lived off French fries, Pringles, white bread, ham, and sausage. Some of the health outcomes make sense, like higher ultra-processed food consumption being associated with more dental cavities in kids. That makes sense, since a lot of them are packed with sugar. Higher ultra-processed food consumption is also associated with an increased risk of high blood pressure. That makes sense, as a lot of them are packed with salt. And with high blood pressures, you could see how there could be a higher rate of cardiovascular events like heart attacks and strokes, and since cardiovascular diseases are our leading killers, you could see how that could lead to increased overall mortality. Obesity is also a no-brainer. A lot of ultra-processed products are packed with calories, and furthermore intentionally engineered with hyper-palatable combinations of fat, sugar, salt, and flavors, so you can't just eat one, promoting weight gain through so-called hedonic eating, meaning eating for pleasure even if you aren't really hungry. OK, I can see all that, but why would there also be a higher overall cancer risk associated with ultra-processed food consumption, or a higher risk of dementia, or a higher risk of inflammatory bowel disease, or a higher risk of irritable bowel syndrome, and a higher risk of developing chronic kidney disease too? Overall, direct associations have been found between exposure to ultra-processed foods and 70% of the health issues that were investigated. A higher risk of dying from all causes put together, a higher risk of getting cancer, not sleeping well, suffering from anxiety, depression, other common mental disorders, wheezing, cardiovascular disease, Crohn's disease, abdominal obesity, obesity in general, fatty liver disease, type 2 diabetes, so increased risk of a variety of chronic diseases and mental health disorders, and apparently not a single study reporting an association between ultra-processed food intake and beneficial health outcomes. There was never a take 2 Twinkies and call me in the morning. Given the large body of evidence implicating ultra-processed foods in human diseases and their ever-increasing consumption around the world, there is a pressing need to recognize their contribution to the global burden of disease. All right, but wait. These are associations. Just because A is correlated with B doesn't mean that A causes B. Maybe B causes A. For example, snapshot-in-time studies show that intake of higher ultra-processed foods is associated with increased odds of depression or anxiety symptoms, but individuals might turn to ultra-processed foods in an attempt to mitigate stress-related anxiety. They don't call it comfort food for nothing. Now, there are longitudinal studies show that greater intake of ultra-processed foods preceded depression, but maybe the food was just used to fend off bad feelings for years before any official diagnosis. But reverse causation, B causing A, seems less plausible when it comes to non-mental health outcomes. For example, it's harder to paint a picture of how a heart attack would cause people to then go on to eat more junk food instead of vice versa. The other big issue when trying to establish cause and effect from observational correlational data is confounding. Maybe the reason A is associated with B is that some third confounding factor, C, is linked to both. For example, if people who eat more junk tend to smoke more, no wonder junk eaters would be dying more, but it would have more to do with the cigarettes they put in their mouth rather than the food. And indeed, People consuming unhealthy diets are also likely to smoke, drink, and not exercise, but we have ways to control for these factors. Indeed, the majority of studies were adjusted for these confounders. The most obvious confounding factor, though, is that highly processed foods just tend to be more likely to be junky crap. The reason cakes, crullers, candy, and cola are bad for us may have less to do with how much they're processed, and more to do with the fact that they are cakes, crullers, candy, and cola, packed with sugar and calories with very few nutrients. Diets high in ultra-processed foods are diets high in added sugar, saturated fat, sodium, calories, displacing more nutritious foods, such as fruits and vegetables, legumes, nuts, and seeds. So maybe ultra-processed foods are just markers of poor diet quality. And indeed, the more ultra-processed foods people eat, the more refined carbs they're eating, the more sugar, saturated fat, sodium, energy, cholesterol, and the less fiber in their diets. So where's the mystery? People who eat more bad foods get more diseases. We already knew that. What does processing per se have to do with it? Because ultra-processed category foods are more likely to be crappy foods, we could use it as kind of a heuristic that they probably won't be good for us. For example, if you made up some rule that you're going to avoid breakfast cereals with cartoon characters on them, you'd probably end up healthier. But not because the graven image of Tony the Tiger magically hastens you to the grave, but rather because they're proxies for high sugar content. But for the developers of the ultra-processed concept, ultra-processed was no proxy. They claim that the harmful effects of ultra-processed foods are not fully captured by their nutrient profile, and even go as far to say we should avoid ultra-processed foods irrespective of their nutrient profiles. Whether ultra-processed diets are detrimental to health simply because they are of poor nutritional quality, or whether the nature and extent of processing itself has health consequences, has been this ongoing debate. How might we settle it? Well, if it were the case that the association between ultra-processed foods and poor health was solely because of the excess saturated fat, sugar, or salt, or just from a less healthful dietary pattern in general, then if we were to adjust for dietary quality, the association between ultra-processed foods and disease should disappear. Right? In other words, if it was all about the nutrients, then people eating crappy diets high in saturated fat, salt, and sugar should have high disease rates regardless of whether they eat more ultra-processed foods or less of them, and people who eat really healthy diets should have low rates of disease regardless of how many ultra-processed foods they consume. But that's not the case. The majority of the associations between ultra-processed foods and obesity and health problems remain significant and unchanged in magnitude after adjustment for diet quality or pattern, meaning even if you balance out dietary quality, those eating more ultra-processed tend to do worse. This suggests that at least some of the adverse consequences of ultra-processed foods are independent of dietary quality, so it's not as though the ultra-processed food companies can just reformulate their products to be lower in salt or sugar and be done with it. There appears to be something about this class of foods beyond the standard nutrient profile that contributes to their deleterious effects, and that's just what I'll be discussing in this extended video series on ultra-processed foods.